In our second interview, we'll be talking to Professor Donald Cameron Walt. After serving in Army intelligence, Professor Walt pursued an academic career, and he is the official historian of the Ministry of Defense. Professor Walt, I'd like to begin with Anglo-Soviet relations in the 1920s. What can you tell me about Soviet espionage activities in those years?
Well, this whole of Soviet intelligence was essentially revolutionary in its attitude up to the end of the 20s. That is to say, it financed organizations that it thought would work towards a revolution in Britain. It put money into the general strike. It financed some of the fringe unions which the Communist Party had captured. It financed the Communist Party. It put money into left-wing newspapers. And of course it did most of this in codes and ciphers that the British could read. I don't know that it really, but it's difficult when one looks at the whole of Soviet intelligence to say that before the end of the 20s, they were really interested in the traditional intelligence gathering purposes of political and military intelligence. I mean, they may have accumulated this, but their whole real bias of things was towards creating a revolutionary situation. And the personnel whom they employed were very largely people drawn in from the European wings of the revolutionary socialist movement as it existed before 1914. And they were drawn in through the Comintern's intelligence organization, and indeed some of the people we know best, one can see them moving from the Comintern into Soviet military intelligence and then into the NKVD, or GPU as it was called in those days, and back again as the various organizations passed through the Stalinist purges. But the first signs of the collection of serious military intelligence comes really in the latter part of the 20s. Richard Zorga, who was to head a very successful Soviet spy ring in Tokyo, appears to have made some kind of a visit to Britain in the late 1920s before he would disappear to the Far East. And it suggested that he was trying to recruit in the British Army, dissidents of that stage. The first Soviet agent in the Foreign Office was a man who appeared to have been short of money and walked into the Soviet embassy in Paris to sell them codes and ciphers, and was sent away with a flea in his ear and then picked up later. He killed himself in 1931, 32, and then the Soviets trapped themselves another man in the same line of business, who was not uncovered until 1939. The Soviet penetration into British industry begins, so far as we can trace it, about 1931-32, using German scientific refugees who have left-wing inclinations from Germany in and the penetration into the RAF centre began in 1932, and the MI5 were onto it pretty quickly, and they penetrated it, and the whole thing was blown up into a trial in 1938. But that phase ended when the British, who had been reading the codes and ciphers and breaking new ones as they came along, raided the Soviet trade delegation in London, in Arcos in 1927. Revealed in Parliament that they were reading the codes and ciphers, and then broke relations with the Soviet Union, and they weren't renewed until the Labour government came into power, second Labour government, 1929-1930. And it's really that, I suppose, if one's looking for a kind of dramatic breach that marks the change.
The reemergence of Germany as a great power and the threat of war encouraged moves to bring Russia into the Anglo-French system of European alliances. But talks on military cooperation in 1939 never really got off the ground. Was there any reluctance on the British side towards a formal alliance with the Russians? Were they considered by the British establishment perhaps to be less than civilized?
No, I don't think it was a matter of civilization. It was partly that the Russian army hadn't won anything for a long time except when it was fighting its own people. So they didn't really have any way of measuring it. It was partly that if you have a hierarchy of senior military officers facing an organization that has shot all its senior military officers, that anybody over the rank of company commander, you're not going to get them taking it very seriously, because they'll think of, good God, this would mean you young Jones and young things, and that they couldn't handle it, you see. And this instinctive gut reaction would be attracted across the point. And it was partly, as I say, that they were denied any serious access to Soviet military information, which might have led them to think differently. But it is also true that the Soviet military, after the purges, were led very largely by a collection of incompetence. There were one or two people like Zhukov who'd survived, and one or two others who had Rokossovsky, and there were one or two people who unexpectedly emerged as major and important military commanders. And after all, given the numbers of soldiers in the Soviet Union, this is not surprising, and one has the example of the French Revolutionary Army and the Napoleonic Army to realize that there are a lot of potential field marshals among the sergeant majors. Marshal Soult, after all, was a man who abandoned the rank of being a sergeant major in the French Royalist Army to become a pastry cook, and still went on to be one of Napoleon's most successful marshals in the field. This is the kind of thing that one can't legislate for. But the thing is that the evidence the British Army could see persuaded them that the Russians couldn't fight the kind of offensive war. What you get in the assessments of the Soviet Army is that they would be very good in defending the Soviet Union, because this was something the Red Army, the Russians had a reputation for doing. But as an offensive force, there wasn't any evidence they'd been an effective offensive force, except against the Turks, since the days of Suvorov. That's a long time ago. Even the British soldiers in those days were better educated historically than they are today.
The closing years of the Second World War demonstrated that the Red Army was indeed capable of offensive warfare. It was also in 1945 the largest and most formidable army in the world. What can you tell me about the interest taken by Western intelligence agencies in Soviet military capabilities in the early post-war years?
I don't know. Where the Soviet Army was concerned, they were, of course, the biggest worry. We had met the Soviet Army in the middle of Germany, and everything they had was about 3 times as big as anything we had, beginning with their tanks and guns. They were about a generation and a half or 2 generations of tanks ahead of us, and that they were about half a generation ahead even of the biggest German ones. Otherwise, and there were an awful lot of these little wiry East Asian Soviet troops carrying weapons everywhere. I mean, I don't know whether they took their guns to bed with them, but they certainly carried them everywhere. And I remember seeing them in Vienna, driving either battered jeeps or all their transport was American. And I was really impressed by the degree of American lend-lease to Russia. I never saw a Russian truck at all. They say the Russians were either driving American jeeps, or they were driving these kind of American 10-ton, 25-ton trucks, which you need a crane to get into the driver's cab of, and seem to require 3 or 4 people driving at the same time when you look at them coming towards you on the road. But they were frightening, because they didn't look as if they were particularly stoppable. But so far as our intelligence was concerned, the main view that they formed, and they formed this back before the war ended, was that you couldn't defeat Russia. It was simply too big, There was too much territory, the resources were too enormous, and the idea of winning a war against the Soviet Union was simply ruled out. It was felt that Napoleon had had the illusion he could defeat Russia, and Hitler had the illusion he could defeat Russia, and at least our intelligent people were under no illusions about the degree of military expertise both of them commanded. And their view was that the Soviet Union could not be defeated in a war. The view was that the Soviet Union might suffer an attack of what was then called Napoleonic ambitions. And it was remembered that at the end of the Napoleonic period there had been Russian troops in Paris. Nobody wanted to see that again. But the biggest worry, I say, was simply that if they got up and marched westwards, particularly if they did it on a Saturday night, the chances are that nobody would know what was happening, and there's certainly nobody in a position to stop them. And they probably pick up enough petrol on the way from dumps around it before they got to the Channel. Otherwise, the only way they were likely to stop is they ran out of fuel. Because there wasn't anything really stopped them. In American troops were under orders to run like hell for the Pyrenees, and most of the American specialists had gone home. American trucks and jeeps and everything else were maintained by DPs and by German civilians, and indeed so were quite a lot of ours, so that if it actually came to war, our own stuff wouldn't have lasted very long because we wouldn't have been able to anybody to maintain it. So that nobody had any real illusions about the prospects of the skeleton Anglo-American forces occupying Germany, or still more Austria, of holding up a Red Army division when it got on the move. That, I say, was a real worry, and it was a worry which was based on potential rather than actuality. I remember when the Tito Comintern break became known, it was an enormous load off our mind in Austria. It seemed highly unlikely that the Russians, particularly if they hadn't started anything against Tito, were prepared to take on the West. And there were moments during the blockade of Berlin, but on the whole we were fairly upbeat about that. The Americans were more cautious. Some of our people, including, oddly enough, some of the alleged left wing in the cabinet, like Naiber Van, were in favor of breaking the Soviet blockade by sending an armored convoy through. It never actually got that far, but the reports of this may be one of the things which made Stalin have second thoughts.
During this period, the Soviet Union had one considerable advantage over the West, and especially Great Britain. They had been informed of Western capabilities and intentions by agents in place such as Kim Philby and Donald Maclean. How valuable was this information?
The Soviets had a remarkable, on paper at any rate, a remarkable system of intelligence about Britain. And we know all the names, the great names, and the people who defected and all that kind of thing. What we don't know is what the Russians made of this. It's very difficult to get a picture, it's difficult for Russian historians to get a picture of how the incoming material was treated. And although the KGB, or some of the KGB people now like making money out of publishing KGB files, what they have published on the famous Cambridge Comintern is psychological assessments of them by the KGB's psychologists. Okay, fair enough, very interesting. But it still tells you nothing about how seriously their information was taken. I mean, from a damage limitation point of view, the kind of thing was undertaken when Maclean did defect. What he could have told the Russians was very scary indeed. What they made of it, we really have no idea. And of course there are precedents in what we do know about Soviet intelligence earlier to show that the Soviets, particularly Stalin, could be awfully easily misled by his own fears. And he was a curious mixture of total paranoia and extreme caution. And indeed one's very grateful to this, because Hitler in his position, I think, would have been much more dangerous, because Hitler tended to go va banque, as he said to Goering once. He tended to stake everything on the toss of a coin or the turn of a card. Stalin was absolutely the opposite, and where we do know what he made of intelligence that came his way, he was very easily misled and enormously suspicious. And if the intelligence he reached him didn't fit in with his presuppositions, then he tended to feel that the agents were in somebody else's pay. So we don't really know what was going on in his mind at this time, particularly as he was in 1947-48 busy in squashing both the marshals who had made such a reputation during the Second World War, and Starnov, the leader of Leningrad, who was dismissed and died rather obscurely. He may have had his hands full with that, and of course just before he died there was another plot, doctors and Jews together, that were supposed to be involved in this. So we don't really know what he made of the intelligence that reached him. And of course we don't know at all anything serious about two sources which we would regard as very important. Firstly, what he was getting, or what was coming to the Soviets out of their ability to read arcades and ciphers. Some people take this very seriously indeed, but it's much more difficult to get a picture of this after 1945, because we don't know very much about Soviet agents in the midst of our organizations. And we don't know as to how far and when the systems of codes and ciphers which we had been using, which the Soviets certainly could read up to 1939, 1940, were changed, and whether the Soviets had any successes in breaking them at a later stage. The chances are they probably did, but one can't be sure, and one can't be sure what they got there, because we don't know what we were entrusting to those particular channels. We do know that the Soviets, in addition to the famous agents in place in Britain and the United States, we know they had a substantial network in France. And later, of course, we know that they had every German who was working in NATO seemed to have a mistress who was working for the KGB. I exaggerate slightly, but honestly not that much. After the discovery that Willy Brandt's right-hand man was a Soviet agent, one tends to feel that if the Soviets didn't know everything that was going on, it wasn't for want of opportunities. It may just simply be they were asking the wrong questions. And of course an awful lot of Soviet intelligence activity was devoted simply toward what we would think of as industrial espionage. It struck everybody like a bomb that the first Soviet equivalent of Concorde looked so much like Concorde it could have been cloned. One thing it couldn't do was fly quite as well as Concorde. Remember, it had a horrible accident over the Paris Air Show. So obviously at some stage or other they copied the wrong plans, or somebody knowing what was going on slid them a dud. But they certainly were engaged from the early stages, from what one knows about Soviet military intelligence in the 20s and 30s. They were targeting not our military secrets in the new sense of our military planning or anything like that, but our armaments factories.
Professor Watt, the damage inflicted on British intelligence by these spies continued, of course, even after their defection to the Soviet Union. What were the long-term effects?
Well, we came awfully close to destroying our own intelligence through our continued conviction on the part of some of the people in the organization that there were more moles to be discovered. It would seem retrospectively, and in the light of the evidence we now have from people like Gordievsky, that this was simply not true. What impresses me reading the histories by former agents of that time is how very bad the top management was, that they weren't capable of taking the people concerned and knocking their heads together and saying, enough is enough, you haven't found anything, shut up. But of course the climate the other side of the Atlantic was not awfully helpful, because they started there with the assumption there would be a mole. And it was just a matter of bullying everybody and screwing everybody up and making everybody's life unpleasant until you found who it was. Now, there's an element of witch hunting in this. You can always find a witch if you look hard enough. And you've got your own tests which satisfy you without satisfying anybody else. But it looks, looking back on it, it looks as if they were, both in America and in this country, they went a long way to destroying their own effectiveness by this particular kind of activity. And I don't think it affected people in the field, in the Middle East or in Ireland or elsewhere, but it certainly had an enormous impact in London.
Turning now to the strategic situation, what effect did the setting up of the Warsaw Treaty Organization in 1955 have on Western perceptions of the military balance of power and the balance of deterrence?
I don't think it was simply the Warsaw Pact was regarded over here as simply being a formal recognition of something which had existed since 1949, 1950. It wasn't taken at all seriously. The Soviet Union was the dominant military figure throughout that part of the world. Nobody took the satellite armies awfully seriously. There were strong doubts everywhere whether their morale would stand up, or whether if they were actually put into action, half of them wouldn't desert to the other side anyway. Doubts which were shared just as strongly as far as I understand on the Soviet side of the line. What one has to remember is that throughout the 50s and 60s, images of what might happen if war came are important, not because war was likely to come or anything like that, but because they played an important part in the political game between both sides and between each side and the public opinion whose support it relied on. I remember Dennis Healy once saying, and this is part illustration, that the unfortunate thing about deterrence is that it took 4 times as much to persuade your own people that the other side was being deterred as it did to deter the other side. And it's that difference between the confidence-building measures which deterrence brings so far as your own people and your own economy and everything that goes with that are concerned, and the military image of what might happen if war broke out, on which so much time was spent, which the military, after all, who would have to fight if it actually happened, were really concerned with. But has diverted us that we spend ages, pages, book after book, shelf after shelf of library on the idiocy or the common sense or whatever of the military theories on either side of the deterrent thing, as though that mattered. What mattered was that the thing worked. What mattered about the debate between was that if you could shake one side's view of it, and suggest that it was too dangerous or wasn't working. I mean, the motives which inspired the campaign for nuclear disarmament were very creditable on one side and deplorably terror-struck on the others. And some of the material they put out, one can only say about them was that they were deliberately designed to scare the hell out of the audience. The purposes behind the people who put this forward were, in their own view, I think, ones for which they deserve a good deal of credit. I'm not so wild about the way they tried to do it. But the effect from the Soviet point of view was, would they work by destroying the deterrence position of the other side or not? And the answer one has to come to, election after election, is that they were not effective in frightening public opinion in the West, and the result was they didn't alter the balance of deterrence at all. And on the other side, the Soviets' army spent its time practicing what would happen if the war and letting it be known through such sources as that they had plans for an armed invasion of Europe and so on. And these were taken very seriously. Mrs. Thatcher was so obsessed by the idea of a Soviet invasion of Central Europe that she was quite prepared to scrap the Royal Navy, and if the Argentines had had the good sense to wait for a year or so, we wouldn't have had the capacity to come and defend the Falklands.
One of the most unpredictable variables in the military balance of power was the rapid pace of technological innovation. How important was technical intelligence in maintaining political stability between the superpowers?
The technical intelligence was important because it was part of the overall perception of how safe are we. Now, nobody in the circumstances of the early 1960s, with a virtual parity of nuclear weapons, and so far as Europe was concerned, a parity of delivery systems on both sides. Actually, I don't think there was such a parity, but people thought there was. Nobody in Europe could feel very relaxed about this. But on the other hand, while the balance was roughly the same, they could feel, if they were particularly unimaginative or strong-nerved or whatever, is that each side was in a Mexican standoff relationship to the other, and that therefore there wasn't too much to worry about unless somebody came up with a breakthrough on the technological side of things. This was one of the private nightmares. It was one of the reasons why so much pressure was put on to the West to abandon the neutron bomb, because the neutron bomb had this sort of horrible unsporting thing. First of all, the West could develop it and the East couldn't. At least the East had shown no sign of it. And secondly, that it actually respected property. You could kill people without damaging anything. And this was terribly capitalist. And the Soviet campaign against it was launched along these lines, and it wasn't the whole effective. I think because when you really asked the deterrence people on the Western side, their reply was, we don't need this. We're doing quite a good job of what we got. But certainly no political figure in the West, apart from the odd maverick, was the least inclined to go to bat on the issue of the nuclear bomb. American presidents shied away from it. British prime ministers threw their hands up in saying, don't ask us, it's nothing to do with us. My feeling about it is that nobody was sure whether it would work. And much more important, nobody was sure that if it did work, that it would simply target enemies and wouldn't kill anybody who was friend or enemy within a certain area of it.
Finally, Professor Walt, from an overall view, did British intelligence ever reliably inform its political masters of Soviet capabilities and intentions? And how did this actually affect government policy?
From 1944-45 onwards, I would be inclined to say, taking one thing with another and all the rest of it, yes. Capabilities. What they could not do was forecast how the Soviet Union would actually behave, because they didn't really have access at the levels that this mattered. This British Foreign Office, who were more practiced in this kind of guessing, were, I think, again, probably right. But they also had to take into consideration public reactions to what the Soviet Union was doing, and they were back in this dilemma which we talked about earlier, where you have to act much more strongly to persuade your own side that they're being defended than you do to prevent the other side from taking a chance against them. And in this particular area, it seems to me that what intelligence reported could not have been awfully important, because you couldn't divulge. If you start divulging what you think of the other side to the other side, you add the hazards that they may disbelieve you, get it wrong, feel they can take a chance, and all the other opportunities which are open to them. And that, on the whole, even if you get the odd diplomat who's prepared to play a bolder game, is not something which those who are responsible politically to their electorates, remembering that they have an opposition waiting to jump on their back if they get things wrong, are inclined to take those particular risks.
Thank you very much, Professor Walt.